What's up, Kingdom of Rock? This is Matt Gibson, and we're here again on this fine 16th of June, 2021. The COVID crisis is starting to come to well, not really an end, but it's beginning to not be as terrible. It's not as terrible as it was. Things are starting to open up for the music industry. And Mike, how about San Francisco? How's things happen up there where all the cable cars and stuff?
Well, I haven't seen a cable car since I was 5 years old, but it's crazy up here. I mean, there's people going out, restaurants, shows are opening up. It's nuts. Not much social distancing going on, so hopefully we'll be okay. But forget about that. That's not why we're here. We're here because of that person up there in that corner.
Yeah. Wait.
So why don't you introduce that person?
Well, today we have the incredible Vaughan Merrick, who is probably best known for being the lead engineer on Amy Winehouse Back to Black and a lot of other incredible musical productions. He's an engineer. He's also a brilliant technologist and is there anything you don't play with when it comes to engineering and electronics and wizardry and things like that?
When it comes to solder, I kind of stay away from that. But
it's the fumes. The fumes are bad.
Yeah, it's the fumes fried that part of my brain, so I don't go back to them. But pretty much anything else, if it's like a new realm of exploration, I'm there.
Well, cool. Awesome. We've been hanging out on Clubhouse quite a bit and got to know each other a little bit. So Mike and I was like, hey, why don't you just come talk to us about audio engineering, technology, and see what kind of cool stuff we could come up with for the Kingdom of Rock community, maybe of interest. So welcome to the show.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been great being on Clubhouse because you get to, I sort of feel like in a lot of ways I've found like kind of my tribe of people, like the tech people meets the music people, and then just being exposed to so many other things. Like I really love the neuroscience rooms because like I went back to school and I studied neuroscience as part of like my degree, but there's really some great stuff happening on there, and it's been such a great way to connect with people since we've all been locked out. It'll be interesting to see what happens when things open up again, and we'll see what happens to Clubhouse, if it disappears or if it stays alive. But it's been great.
I think what's been great for us, I mean, Matt's been using it. I came to it late. Matt's been using it for marketing. We've met a lot of people that we would normally probably never meet if it wasn't for the fact Clubhouse was there and the pandemic was. So that's awesome. I mean, at first when I got onto it, it's like, really, we're here for, people are on this for hours, just going blah 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 blah. But you're right. There are some very awesome moments that go on. So.
Yeah, I've heard some really amazing conversations. I've heard some really incredible moments, which I won't divulge because they're probably some famous people who said some kind of embarrassing things, but it's been fantastic. And really just getting to know like a broader community of creative people there, as well as a cross influence of people from politics and economics and all ways of life. I think for music, like, music is the thread that like ties all the sort of individual components of society together. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's just been like a fascinating experience. And I've, it's been such a positive to get to know so many different people there and just abstract so many different people's experiences and get to know where people are coming from. I mean, for me, that's what music is all about. So it's just been great.
It's definitely a glue that holds a lot of disciplines together, and I think you're kind of a Renaissance man like myself, where you just you're really into stuff for a while, and then you kind of go over here for a while, and then you go over here for a while, and it's like Clubhouse is really cool because you can scratch your intellectual sweet tooth in like so many different categories and ways and everything. So it's been a real blessing for me too. And I learned a lot of things that I didn't know, especially about the music business. And, Mike has been trying to tell me, but I didn't listen to Mike because why would I do that? Mike's he's my cranky co-host that gives me advice that I ignore because I'm stupid.
Speaking of cranky, did you just call yourself a Renaissance man, by the way? Did that just happen?
Maybe a little bit.
If you can call yourself a Renaissance man.
Oh, that's improper form. That's not the gentleman's code.
I think you just did, so you might be wrong there, Michael.
I might be wrong. It happened. You're right. It happened.
I have a little John Wayne in my personality, so I just kind of get that cocky, kind of.
So that's in other words, that's a toupee you're wearing. Is that
it's totally fake. It's totally. I actually I'm going bald for the summer because it was 112 here yesterday in Vegas. It was a bit warm.
Yeah,
but I like it.
That's too hot for me. At least it's dry heat though, right? It's not the East Coast like
muggy Charleston, South Carolina, where you can scoop out water out of the atmosphere in spoons and drink it. Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, so I've totally taken this off into the bantering categories here. So I'm gonna pass it off to Mike and let him use his amazing journalistic skills to bring the conversation to a more productive.
You can't say I have amazing journalistic skills either, even though you just did.
Jeez, you got to write this. You got to email me this before the show, so I can't keep up.
Well, Vaughan, we've been lucky enough. Matt and I have been lucky enough to have some, Grammy winners, et cetera, on the show. But it's always interesting when we have people like you on here because I think for a lot of the home recordists or people in the Kingdom of Rock who are aspiring to be engineers or producers. Is there anything that it's always interesting to hear from you guys? I obviously started out the same as everybody else doing stuff at home, or maybe because you're a Renaissance man, you actually built a recording studio out of a matchstick. I don't know. But what are some of the skills that you notice you needed when all of a sudden you get into these situations with Amy Winehouse or Mark Ronson or whatever? What's the difference between somebody starting out, both from technical and just overall vibe factor and how you have to manage yourself in that level of professional recording?
That's a great question. I particularly in this day and age. So when I came up, I started working in a fairly large recording studio in Manhattan called Soundtrack. That was a 7-room facility. And I started right out of high school. And that was, back then there was very few programs for recording music. And so for most people, it was like you just learned on the job. So you got an internship, you did the crappy stuff of, cleaning the toilet and running errands and all that stuff. And once you spent enough, they give you like manuals and there was, recording technology books that you read through. Once you got enough competency to be in the rooms, you'd become an assistant engineer. You learn under like the greatest people who were doing it at the time, who were the hired engineers and the producers and the artists. And when I started the studio that I worked at, did a lot of hip hop records, but also like kind of, I remember like 3 weeks after I was working there, I got thrown into a session with like some of the surviving members of the Beach Boys. When I say surviving, I mean of the band, right?
Yeah.
And this is like 3 months out of high school, and I was kind of like, "Wait, what just happened?" But so you would learn from and then there was also the commercial jingle side of the work, and you kind of decided early on, like, do I want to do music or do I want to do more commercial work? And for me, it was always the music. So it was great environment to be to learn a lot of skills both on the commercial side and the music side, but then also to be exposed to a lot of different styles of music. And I was at that studio for 2.5 years, 3 years, and then I went to another studio called Axis Studios, which was run by the legendary DJ Francois Kevorkian, who did Depeche Mode's Violator record and Kraftwerk's Electric Cafe record. And that studio was really like a wonderful, wonderful place because at that time, most studios didn't really have a lot of like sort of ancillary gear. Like there'd be a large console like an SSL or a Neve and like a little bit of outboard gear.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, that was it. Whereas Francois' rooms were like fully kitted out with MIDI gear and like tons and tons of outboard gear, and it just came with the room. It wasn't like extra rental stuff. So I got exposed to a lot of house records there, more R&B stuff there, and just learned a lot of technology stuff. Francois has always been like very future oriented, and so I mean, I was quite future oriented as well at the time, although much younger, of course. And so it was like really a great learning environment for me to feel like, our interests were very much aligned and thinking about like the future of music and where technology was taking us. So, we were working in Pro Tools in the late 90s, like the moment it went into like went from whatever was Sound Designer into Pro Tools. Where it went into like an actual multi-track machine and you could start mixing in the box. And I was like mixing in the box, like everyone else was like, are you crazy? And, 12 years later, 13 years later, everyone's like mixing in the box. So it was a great environment, full of another person who came out of there is my friend Ann Mincelli, who runs Alicia Keys' studio, Jungle City. And, it was just it was a great environment to come out of that place, like having experience with big consoles, analog synthesizers, all the sequencing, the MIDI sequencing stuff, and like tons of, other technology that just expanded the sort of creative palette. So it was fantastic.
When you, like, let's say that when the Beach Boys came in at that early age, were some of the engineers that you were working with, were they kind of saying, now look, Vaughan, I don't want you to say shit. I don't want you to get in the way. These are big shots. You got to stand on the corner. Or are they like, you need to figure it out yourself. And if you get your butt kicked by Mike Love or whoever, that's just the way it goes.
Yeah, I mean, it was, yeah. So I didn't fully answer your question, but yeah, I mean, I think that's all to say that you basically were told to sit in the corner and just absorb. And so I think for younger people these days, like it's a real challenge because some of those studios still exist, although most in New York have gone away. But, that was that opportunity of like being in an environment where you were basically there to serve, like sort of taught like that kind of mentality around, whether you're an engineer or producer, like you're there to like serve the process, whether it's like, the investing entity being the label or the artist, you're kind of like trying to bridge those interests. So yeah, I mean, really a lot of it was just learning through osmosis. And then like, time off, you would like spend time like really like experimenting and trying to figure out like what works and what doesn't. And I feel like, I mean, the fact that technology has gotten cheap and a lot of people have the tools these days is fantastic, but without having that kind of guiding light about, of how sessions work, I wonder how people like overcome those challenges these days, because that's a big part of like what engineering is. Obviously, there's a technical part of it, but a big part of the job is to sort of eliminate the technology from the creative flow, right? It's to know how to run all that stuff so that the moment people feel inspired, you're capturing it and you're not like, sort of introducing friction between like the creativity and the documenting of it.
Yeah, well, I think that's, and navigating that, since you're all in on that stuff, is always interesting to me how different people deal with it. I mean, I'm just reading this book on Frank Sinatra and for his duets record. And first day he walked into Capitol, they had an isolation booth set up, and he walked in and said, okay, no. And he just walked out, left the whole orchestra there. So, I mean, it's like being able to, as you said, bridge these gaps between the technology, the talent, and make sure that everybody is comfortable enough to create. That's a tough gig sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why, so much of it is like anticipating. So what you'd learn in the studio environment was like just knowing, like, you get to know what the flow of sessions were, and you just get to anticipate like what the general process was. But also because things are often like kind of someone has a sudden moment of inspiration, like there are certain keys that you lock into, that like kind of let you know, oh, this person might want to go record this part. I need to like make sure that this is all set up. They might not, but you want to make sure that all that stuff is like set up in advance so that if they do feel that moment of inspiration, like you're already ready to go. And being in a studio environment and working, I mean, I was working so many hours then. Typically the sessions were like 16-hour sessions. And when I was doing like a lot of house records, like those records would be up for 30 hours, like on a regular basis. Because you do like an A side, and that would take about 12 hours. And then you do like a dub mix, and that would be another, 16 hours. So, you spent all your time in the studio, and you spend enough time doing anything, practicing anything, you start to learn the patterns, and you can anticipate like how the patterns are going to play out. So I think that was a real benefit of that. Although I don't, I wouldn't care to relive those 30-hour sessions. That was enough. The longest I've ever been up straight is 42 hours. It's like not recommended.
I think that's, well, once again, we'll get back to this, but you did make a comment about younger people today knowing the flow of sessions. But I think that's something that a lot of people forget who haven't been in, let's say, I don't know, the glory years of the big studios is, if you're an engineer, you were kind of held captive by the artist and your health. You don't go home until they go home. If they want to listen to a playback at 1,000,000 dB, your hearing is getting slaughtered, but you're not about to tell, a big artist, hey, I'm going to crank this down a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of, health issues that I don't think people realize when they get into that world.
Yeah.
I mean, we had Ben Watkins from Juno Reactor on here, and he said that during the first Matrix, he felt that he had almost died because he no sleep and just work. He said he almost killed himself. So like, you don't think about that kind of in the trenches type thing. You're like, oh yeah, man, we're just in the studio and the Beatles came in and we all just partied all night and, played music together. It was just so fun. You only hear those little occasional things that happen, but the 30-hour grind yourself into dust at the console, that does not sound.
Yeah. And I think the volume thing is what ultimately caused me to get out of engineering and move more into production and just owning a studio and letting other people worry about it. Because I worked on some soundtrack for the Max Headroom TV show, and I won't mention the artist, but all the studios would have these big party speakers. He would crank up the soundtrack. It was literally 200 dB. You couldn't get away from it. I mean, the sound was so crushing. It almost felt like, my sphincter was just getting, destroyed. And again, I don't know how you dealt with that stuff in the day, or if you were unlucky enough to have those people, but it is difficult to go, dude, why are we listening to this crap so loud? Turn it down, because you can't do that. You're just a facilitator.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you could, particularly if it was like so loud that you knew they were going to blow the speakers, and like that there would be hell to pay if that happened. But generally, I mean, you'd have earplugs, or you just leave the room. One of those things. But yeah, I mean, it's brutal. It's amazing that my ears aren't ringing, considering how much loud volume we all had to put up with.
And then back to what you mentioned about younger people in the flow of a session. Are you alluding to or have some comments about so much production is done, peer-to-peer or alone in a home studio these days, that there's really not a lot of experience about what you're alluding to, about having to go into a place with other people and other artists and work, in concert with a whole bunch of other peeps?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really alluding to that, but I think it's a great point because, it's, I've said this before, it's like, you can't really make a social art in an antisocial climate, right? And I think that, while all, the sort of democratization of all this technology is fantastic in a lot of ways because it's allowed a lot of people to be creative in ways that they weren't before. Also, like not having that social component is, I think, not great for the music. There was a neuroscience journal article that came out just this last week out of I can't remember the university. It's a university in Israel, and they're really like looking at like the correlates between music and mental health, like down to like very specific neurotransmitters, including dopamine and cortisol, and like what, how music like brings people together, and what the sort of neural reactions are when people are in a social space together, whether they're singing together or like they're having this kind of group communal experience, which, on some level, it's like we see, that communal experience happening in other domains, whether it's religion or sports or whatever. But obviously, like this coming together and creating together, like, if you're, I guess you're not really creating together if you're an audience at a concert, but there is an element of this, of the back and forth, the energy that goes back and forth between an audience and the people on the stage, whether they're athletes or they're musicians. And, I think that as music kind of gets, or gets more kind of abstracted away from like the studio, and people are kind of doing things like on their own, there's an important element, I think, to how records used to be made, which I think even younger people really hear, which is, that conversations that's happening between musicians. And a few years ago, there were a couple of venture capital firms that reached out to me who were thinking about, investing in artificial intelligence for music. And I think, I know Matt's working on this. I think for what he's doing, it's like, okay, so
yeah, Mike's the COO of Neural Tunes.
Okay, okay, great, fantastic. Yeah. So, in that context, like it really works, but in a sort of general sense, it's like, we have to remember that like music is a narrative about conversations between musicians and their instruments, and then that collective relationship with other musicians and their instruments, and that collective relationship with an audience. And that goes back and forth, this like, putting out and feedback that you get. And then you also get the feedback from the space that you're performing in, because the space is talking back to you. Like the reverb is a reflection of architecture, right? It's a reflection of nature and man-made organization that's happened before. And that's all, like all of that comes together to make like what the music is. And I think it is just like very important to remember that all those components are like what really bring the magic together in a intentional kind of inspired way.
What do you think as far as, modern production techniques, kind of some people say we're in the age of the individual, where it's all about the individual versus the group or the team. Like, what do you think? Do you think that's opportunities for artists to capitalize on? Like, if everyone else is kind of, it's all about me, and you kind of pivot and do the contrarian thing and be like, no, it's all about you. It's all about everybody. It's all about us.
It is all about us. I mean, I think that, at the end of the day, it's like, I mean, this is kind of what I'm saying. It's music is a conversation, right? It's like you put something out in the world and people react to it. And then they reply, and then you react to that. And the great artists like take that feedback and they combine it to tell new stories that are unique to their experience. And obviously there's some that are better than others at doing that. But at the end of the day, this is about a conversation. So if you're isolating yourself in a corner and not being part of that conversation, you're just kind of organizing sound. It might be interesting to you, but like whether that translates to an audience or not is another question, and sort of like, luck of the draw, I guess.
Why do you think the Back to Black album was so successful? Like, as far as, obviously Amy's an incredible artist, and we were kind of talking offline a little bit about this the other day, and you'd mentioned to me that she came in very prepared to sing and rehearsed and knew what she wanted, knew what she was going to do. But what was the some of the factors that led to the success of that album from your perspective?
Well, I'll start off by saying, well, there are many things that contributed to the success of that record, especially the experiences that all of us had who contributed to that record before, right? And this is like one of those things where people like, talk about like, oh, someone only wants to pay me so much, to do a blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, you're not paying for the hours that I'm spending, you're paying for the experience. And that record is actually like a really good example of like where a number of factors came together in kind of, a lucky way, or a serendipitous way, I guess I should say. That, I remember when we made the record thinking like, this record's not going to do anything. I know it's amazing and it's really good, and I'd be very proud to have worked on this record, but like given the musical environment at the time, it just didn't seem like it was gonna blow up. And I think many things sort of came into place at the right time. Like I understood the technology in a very specific way, that allowed me to like take the performances and perfect them in a way that didn't sound like it was manufactured. But also the band, I think Mark wanted to work with those guys, although we had like a pre-production meeting where we kind of discussed different strategies about making the record. And one of them was like to work with more seasoned session musicians, and he didn't want to do that. And I'm not really sure why. And I shouldn't speak for Mark, but I think that he just intimated that he wanted the sort of younger energy that those guys had. And those guys have been doing their thing for a while, and they've been, they're kind of a collective group of people who are playing in like 3 or 4 different other bands. So they had their own kind of experience. And so it's a combination of, and I think for Mark, like, I had made Mark's first record, which was more of like a hip hop record. And I think he was kind of maturing from this place of being like a hip hop DJ, doing like hip hop style productions, and then wanting to work with more, real musicians. And so it was this combination of Amy, like not having blown up on her first record, and Mark, she got introduced to Mark, they got introduced to each other, they hit it off, and they sort of, he like helped her with the songs to like sort of, massage them into place. And then there was like some pre-production with the Dap Kings, and we did the record very quickly. So I think we did 6 songs that we did in 3 days. And then I took the tracks home and I sort of finessed them into place. That took about 10 days. And then we did 3 days of vocals and maybe a day or 2 of horns. She did 2 songs a day, and she just fucking killed it. It was just like, it was like, holy shit. It was like so apparent that she lived in the music. She knew how she wanted to execute it. She knew how she wanted her background stacks, like what the intervals were in advance. Like, it was no like, oh, let me play around and see if this works, and then come into the studio and sort of contemplate it. It was just like bam, 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 bam. And, I think on each song, I don't think we did more than 5 takes of her vocals, like of the leads. And each one was incredible. We ended up comping them because we had the material. So it was like, yeah, okay, we're going to obviously try and get the best bits. But every one of her takes was like incredible. And it was just very clear that she was naturally talented, but she'd spent a lot of time with the music in advance of like actually recording it.
That's cool. So as far as, Amy's experience in the studio with you, and like, what do you remember the most about her? Like, because obviously tragically she passed away a few years back, and, we all were blown away by that. And it's, we didn't really get to know her very well, Yeah.
I'm not really sure who did. She's quite coy and reserved. And maybe that's why she got along with Mark really well, because Mark's kind of similar. like great people. But she wasn't, she was more interested in going to play pool at the bar than she was like, it's like, how quickly can I get out of here? It was kind of funny. Most artists want to spend as much time in the studio as possible. And she was kind of like, all right, I'm ready to do this. And she went in there and did it. And, a few hours later, we had what we needed. And she was like, can I go now? I was like, yep, that was amazing. Thank you very much.
It's interesting too. You can make great records both ways with, as you mentioned earlier, seasoned studio musicians or a band. But, it's always interesting to me throughout music history, at least rock music history, there's always a band works up, they get a deal, and then immediately, the band that kind of grabbed the ears of the A&R people, first thing they do is kind of try to delete all those people and get other people in to record the stuff. And like I said, both, bands and studio musicians, there's been a lot of hits made by both, but it is interesting that Mark made the choice for whatever reason, to go with them.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that choice other than that I think that he wanted a younger vibe and something that wasn't quite as mature as you might get from like session players. I mean, it's the sort of the thing of like in doing my own kind of neuro research. I've done a lot of work or just studying like how decisions are made, and sort of coined my own phrase about creativity, which is sort of a cycle of three phases, which is exploration, experience, and expertise. And so that exploration stage, I think, is something that's unique amongst creative people, is they're really comfortable in this exploration phase, where it's like you're just trying different things out. Most of the time they don't work out, but you're just going down different rabbit holes, finding things that work. And when you find something that works, then you start building around that. You start building patterns and practices. And at some point, that becomes like, the muscle memory becomes really ingrained, like the neural pathways become really solidified. And when you're playing music and you're expressing music, it's more from an emotional place than like a cognitive, like, oh, I've got to do this with my hands or whatever, right? It's like, or with my voice or whatever. It becomes the muscle memory that's associated with the execution is just like.
Whoops.
Oh, we lost him.
It's like we lost him for a sec. He's working on his phone, everybody, but I'm sure Matt will let him back in a sec. Hopefully.
Yeah, he'll come back.
But that was an interesting, just the fact that he's so into like neuroscience. I mean, it's interesting. He's kind of going in that direction about decision making and art. I mean, that's an awesome, tangent that we typically don't talk about here.
Yeah, it's certainly like the creative process is like it seems like something that people don't think about too much. Like they don't deconstruct it and analyze it in a kind of scientific way like that, but I think it's true. Definitely artists have that kind of, not sweet tooth, but what would be the inclination to explore and just kind of like my first song that I ever tried to record, like the first take was an unrecognizable pile of garbage. It was just like, if I would have let anyone hear that, they would be like, this is terrible. You should quit music. But you just keep polishing and polishing until you finally get something, I guess, and here's Vaughan back again.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
That's all right. We didn't like what you were saying, so we just kicked it out for a second.
I think the Grecian muses do not want to hear about neuroscience and decision.
So that level of expertise that you gain, where it's just like an emotional expression, but you get to that point and you sort of circle back because your curiosity gets you, and you go back into that exploration stage. So there's this cycle that happens. Now I can't remember exactly why I brought this up, but
you were talking about the different stages of creativity and how you developed your own unique kind of way of expressing that.
Yeah.
through the three stages.
I guess I was going back to the session musician. So
Yes.
that's just a sort of precursor to explain, you know, like what tends to happen with musicians as they mature, as they get much better, right? And you would expect that. But sometimes like that energy, like some of my favorite records are like these Brian Ferry records that are just like, he's got these incredible musicians, and I absolutely love how beautiful those records are, but they don't sound like youthful records, right? They
Yeah.
sound like that age group. And so I think that, Mark didn't express this, but I think that he intimated it, at least, sort of had that feeling of like he wanted that energy. And, after he made that clear, I was like, well, if that's what you want, I know, because I'd done a bunch of work where, because I've been an early adopter of technology and using Beat Detective and Pro Tools and Auto-Tune to like fix things to like make them perfect, and realizing that in almost all cases it made things worse. That I knew how to use those tools in such a way that people wouldn't be able to hear that they were used, but that they would elevate the performances to be something that would be, Michael, as you were mentioning, bands getting like signed to labels, and labels like disrupting like the whole inner workings of the band because so-and-so's not good enough or whatever. And so from my perspective was like, because I had heard what they were doing before, and I was like, well, if a major label was here, like hearing these guys play, they might be like suspicious that they're not up to snuff. But I knew based on like my experience that I could take whatever they did and make it sound like what a label would want to hear, without making it sound, like without suffocating the creativity and the energy out of it. So that was really like, the thing that I brought to that record, probably more than anything else.
Well, I mean, that is almost a mystical skill, because as you well know, you can use Beat Detective or Auto-Tune technology, and you really can't either make it like an effect so it sounds like Martian music, or make everything just really stiff and calculated and mathematical. So it almost is, that's almost like a superpower you probably have, to be able to use that technology and make it sound organic.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it comes from, because I grew up listening to mostly classical music, and I didn't really tune into popular music until I was about 10. And that was like, like early 80s, when the sort of new wave synth music was really taking off. And I was really keyed into that. And like, so many things were happening at that point in time. Like there was a space shuttle program and this new technology of music, and it sort of felt like this new era was happening. So I think I've spent most of my career like being quite good at knowing how to marry those two elements together, like excellent musicianship and technology, and knowing like sometimes like you want the music to have like a very kind of mechanical kind of vibe to it, in which case then all those tools, whether it's MIDI or Beat Detective or Auto-Tune, all those things, like that they can really solidify like a particular vibe. But if you're just careless about it and you're like, well, I was told that you got to get everything on the grid and like make it, it just becomes mechanical, and like and the magic of human, individuality comes into like the swing, the intention, the style. It's like that quote that I think came from Jerry Garcia, which is style is the mistakes that you can't help but make. And when you iron that stuff out, then you take out the individuality from the music. I think so much of like what makes so many great records sort of pre-MIDI is really hearing that individuality of the musician coming through on the recording, because the technology wasn't really there to like iron it out.
Right? I remember like I was a shredder in the 80s. That was my vibe, And so yeah. I was very critical of sloppy guitar playing. And I love Angus Young. I think he's an incredible guitar player, but he's sloppy. He plays sloppy, but he pulls it off and makes it convincing, because he just does. And I don't know why, but it's like
it's the drummer. That band is the drummer. I'm telling you, it is. Go listen to those records. It's a drummer, and it's this swing. It's like it's how the drummer like hits the hi-hats, and it's how Angus like plays like the guitar against the beat. That's where the vibe is coming from. It's that combination.
Yeah, but
I've listened to those records, and I'm right there with you. And I'm like, what is it that makes these records so powerful? And from my point of view, I'm 99% sure it's the drummer.
Well, when you're a young guitarist, shredder, and you're like, oh, I'm better than him. You think that in your head, but what you aren't thinking about is what he's created and actually released into the world versus just sitting there in the crowd going, I could play that. Well, I could play that too. And you just,
on that regard, and actually to Vaughn's point about collaboration, I just finished reading that book, Why Charlie Watts Matters. And the whole premise of the book is that if you listen to Charlie Watts, it's like, when did this guy start playing drums? A year ago? But that intangible swing that he has from being just so into jazz and leaving stuff out. And there's a hysterical, I mentioned this before, I think on the show even, where, one of his things is like, if you're the kind of drummer when you're going, flying so high like some gal in the sky, and you hit like the cymbal on sky, fuck you. It just cracked me up because it was, that's the point of space and all that. And even what you're talking about, Angus and, the AC/DC's drummer, is how that you're just waiting for that snare. Oh, is it, please hit it. Just infinitesimal moments of time where it's like, bump, bump, it's all that's so great. And where Angus falls into that, it's crazy.
Well, I think it's like, you can divide out the temporal part of it, or the rhythmic part, and the pitch part. It's like the same. It's like the space in between the notes is like where you really feel the tension and release, right? Mm-hmm. I did a session. I've told this story many times with Isaac Hayes a few months before he passed away, which was, it's like kind of an amazing thing. It was like a duet record, and he went in and I'm not sure if the record came out actually, but anyway, he went and did his vocals, which were pretty pitchy even by my standards. At this point, I'd used autotune enough, and I felt like, it wasn't really making things better. So he came back in out of the booth, and he was like, how was it? I was like, it was great, Isaac, but there may be a couple of moments we could fix up. He's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, let's listen down. And at this point, I'd already like figured out that it's like the problem with autotune is like, once you go in and fix everything, and everything bothers you, and then you've got to fix everything, and then the whole thing sucks, right?
Yeah.
So my strategy with autotune is like, if you listen down to the song and there's a note that pulls you out of the song, fix that, but don't listen to the song and go like, what do I have to fix here? Because that you'll fuck it up. So we listened down to the song. I was like, and I pointed out a couple of spots, and we got to the end of the song, and I'm like, what do you think? And he says, the notes in between the notes is where the grease is. You don't fix that. And I was like, you're spot on. And so I think that attitude applies to pitch, but it also applies to timing. Like, obviously, like if you're so far out of the pocket that you're creating like a train wreck, like that's not good. But if it's a vibe and you can do it consistently, and it's like, part of like building like tension within the track, if you swing enough, like you sort of like have this thing that makes people do this instead of this, right?
Well, and even like with pitch, like Korn did a lot of what do you call that? Not distortion, where it's dissonance. They played a lot of dissonance chords, but they used it percussively. Yeah. And it's kind of it's not the right chord for the key signature sometimes.
Right.
But they did it percussively in a way that sold it. And it was kind of like, it's like the rules, and then you use the rules from something else and use it on this, and it works. So like maybe it's just a matter of like, would you say it's fair to say that it's just always a big puzzle? Like it's just
Oh yeah,
trying to make it all like fit together.
Of course. I mean, that's a perfect way of summing it up. I mean, I think the thing with creativity is that it needs to be fenced, right? Because if you have no fencing, then you'll just, wander off into the distance and never come back.
Well,
right?
like John Cage or Frank Zappa, like different levels of not having fences.
I think you can, if you establish like a level of trust with an audience, you can take them on a journey. Like Radiohead did that very effectively, right? It's like their first record is kind of fairly commercial, and then the second record is like still pretty commercial, but like a little bit off kilter. And then the third record is like, all right, we're going in a different direction. And then it's like, forget it. We're just doing something else. But because the trust is there with the audience, you can do that. I mean, George Michael kind of had a similar thing. Not that I would ever compare those two artists, but like the fact that George Michael sort of established his career as being like a cheesy, pop singer with Wham, and then went off and did his own career and kind of just went off of center and then continued to go off of center. And but there was an audience that stuck with him because he was an incredible singer, and he was like, fuck you, I'm not doing like what you tell me kind of thing, right? It's like he was like, I want to go explore the thing that's like very meaningful to me in my life, and like you're either along for the ride or you're not.
Well, I remember
go ahead.
I was just gonna say Linkin Park is an example of how I don't feel it went well by doing that. Like Hybrid Theory was such a killer record as a metalhead. Yeah. And so I was like, I will stick with this band forever. And then they just went, and I was like, what? I don't even know what this is. What is this? It was so far, like they went so far in the opposite direction that I didn't even identify with them anymore.
Yeah, I think you have to make sure that if you're going to go off in a different direction, there still has to be like an inner, what they refer to in neuroscience is like space of possibilities, which is kind of like the aggregation of your life's experience. So there needs to be some kind of intersection of the space of possibilities between you and your audience. And if you just disconnect from that and go zooming off into another realm, like you can't expect people to follow you. Like you still have to have elements of like what you built trust around, and then like say like, all right, we're leaving this room. Are you coming with me? So there needs to be like, if you're going to go off into a different direction, there needs to be some element that bridges between what you've done before into where you're going.
Well, I know there's no answer for this, but it is interesting, whether it's Radiohead or George Michael, some artists seem to kind of get away with it, however you want to say that. We're not talking about record sales, but they have an audience that says, okay, whatever you do, I'm sticking with you. And some artists, they might even make a small change, like maybe they go from mostly big ass distorted guitars to like acoustic and cleaner, and then the audience just goes, we're done with you. I mean, it's interesting because I'm not sure if that's an artistic thing or just, or as you mentioned, you moved out of the comfort zone with your audience or what, but some people do get away with it no matter what they seem to do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of like a case-by-case scenario. So where that works and where it doesn't work, I think it probably has something to do with like if you're like a metal band and all of a sudden like you decide to go like, make Air Supply records, like it's going to be weird, right? It's
I'm
like
all out of love.
Yeah, it's going to be weird. But
although metal yacht rock would be cool.
It would be cool. Yeah, definitely. It definitely would be cool. But you need some kind of way to bridge the gap, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that is. Metal Steely Dan or something?
My Metal Steely Dan. Oh my gosh. That's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure, I guess it's so dependent on like what that relationship with the audience is. I think that has a lot to do with it, and it's like if you're an artist, it's a little bit obviously you can't please everyone, like you never will. You just have to leave that behind. But you also have to be, respectful to your fans, because if you shit on them, like they're what put you there. So you don't want to be completely slave to like whatever they're like, I won't put up with this, I won't put up with that. But also it is a relationship, right? It's like music, as I was saying before, it's like it's a representation of relationships. It's a narrative about, stories about relationships, whether they're very personal relationships, familial relationships, like regional relationships, national relationships, all those things like are part of like the music body. So it's like you have to respect those relationships if you're going to like, if you sit down to a dinner table and you start holding a certain kind of conversation, and then you start cussing everyone out unprovoked, like everyone's going to be like, what the fuck, right?
Well,
But if you're like having a conversation about, I don't know, religion, you posit it, you pivot into politics, like you might have a better chance because you're already on like, on dangerous territory.
Yeah,
So
right.
it's like whatever, you know what to expect.
Well,
But
do you think when bands kind of decline that it's more often their miscalculation versus just society changing?
I think it's a combination of things. So I think, from an organizational perspective, like if you study organizational science, like part of like what you want older people who've got the wisdom, who know patterns, but you also want younger people who don't know those patterns yet, but are like flowing with the sort of shifting sands of youth culture, right? And like how people are reinventing language and music and all those things, and that combination is like what makes a dynamic society. There's something that's like wedged right in there, which is like at around age 27, the brain becomes like very solidified, right? It's like at that point, your maturation stage, like kind of like it doesn't stop altogether, but the brain is more or less like codified in terms of like how it's going to work, because neural pruning stops at that point. So people tend to sort of get a little bit more set in their ways after that age, which is one of the reasons why like the military goes after people when they're young, right? Because it's like much easier to mold people, or religions too. It's like if you get people when they're young. And part of the reason why the music business, I mean, this isn't something that's spoken, but I think, and I don't know how deliberate it is, but I think a part of the reason why the music business really caters to a younger audience is because it's easier to get people to buy into something that like is their thing, rather than trying to convince them that like, this older music that's really well refined is something that they should be listening to. I mean, obviously there are other things that are part of that, because generations like have ways of looking at things that are unique to generations. It's like their parents thought a certain way, like their younger siblings think a certain way, like it's our understandings of context, of place and time are different. But it is important to recognize that like 26 to 29 era is like, for most people, that becomes like a point after which becomes like you can get into a vibe where neuroplasticity continues to be like part of your exploration and part of like your creative process. But for most people, it becomes much more difficult to adapt. Like they become much more codified in terms of like what they're, how they view the world, how they view processes. And so I think, as bands get older, a lot of times like the audience who's like growing up with them doesn't necessarily want to see them change. So if a band is going to do that, they've got to do it in such a way that they catch those people emotionally, so that they want to follow them. There's something there that's either intellectually interesting or emotionally interesting. It's like, because a lot of bands, like, they don't want to make the same record over and over and over again. It goes back to that exploration, experience, expertise thing. It's like, I got good at this. I know how to make those records. I want to go back to the exploration stage. I want to, that my life has changed, like how I view my relationship with music has changed. I want to explore like what that means in this particular context of space and time, as opposed to the context of space and time when I was 23. So there's a bunch of things that are part of this process of bands maturing and whether their audiences follow with them that are complicated.
Well, as far as I've been doing some study on schemas in relation to music and neural tunes in particular, because a lot of people they've tried to use music as medicine before, but it's like they're ignoring the fact that schemas are super important to the individual. So like if you've listened to Slayer your whole life and that's your band, and you're stressed out and I give you some wind chimes with a harp in the background, that might not make you feel less anxious.
Yeah.
You know, because of you can even be influenced, your music schemas and preferences can be influenced in the womb. They've done some studies on. So like it's the reason that we're trying to use popular music for neural tunes versus create therapeutic music is because of the fact that we already know that we self-medicate with music.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's due to familiarity, maybe positive memories that we have associated with the music. It's not just the song, it's many different factors. And so I do think that I like what you're saying about kind of how complicated the dynamic is of a band being successful and practical and useful to people their whole career. That is not it's not a straight trajectory. It's like it's everywhere, you know, and you may not ever get to that peak that you were at when you were in your 20s or 30s or whatever, and you were maybe in popular music and people were like, oh wow, this is new and this is my jam. And then, you know, 20 years later, people are just like, play the jam again. It's like, no, I don't want to play that again. But
right.
You know, like, yeah.
Well, it's also interesting to me from a kind of a group psychology, if that's even the right phrase, where, you know, I mean, I'm old enough, like when I grew up, I listened to my parents' music, you know, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby. I mean, because that's what was in the house. That's what, you know, Broadway stuff. And then for me, and obviously gazillions of other people, when the Beatles popped on the Ed Sullivan Show, or Elvis ended up on whatever show, the Alabama Player Hayride or whatever that was, you know, I changed like immediately. Like I pivoted immediately. Like this stuff that is my entire learning process, the schemas I had at that point in my youth, all of a sudden it was like, I'm gone, you know, and an entire generation made that same left turn. It's like Broadway's not doing it for us anymore. You know, Frankie Valli's not doing it for us anymore.
Yeah.
Valley's not doing it for us anymore.
Well, you know, and it goes back to the thing that I was saying about the younger than 27, the neuroplasticity is much greater. So it's easier for a, you know, youth to pivot, you know, their sentiments and their aesthetic like perspective. And particularly because I think that it is part of sort of, you know, emergent, there's something biological that happens that, and maybe it's just because the foundations of reality have changed as the population grows and technology accelerates and how people understand relationships change. And, you know, youth are like much more likely to glom on to like new technologies because they're not like going like, oh, but is this better than the other thing? It's like, they're just like curious, right? So so like TikTok, for instance, it's like they just latch on to, whereas like older people are like, oh, I got to get on another social media. You know, it's like that whole thing. It's like generations sort of define themselves based on like the context of where they were growing up and that sort of shifting foundational sands that shapes their world and how they perceive things. And then they will get to a point where they looked at things a certain way, and the younger generation will have that same kind of attitude, right? Where it's like they're more malleable to like, you know, the way things are changing and by necessity, right? It's like the world is constantly changing, and so you know, as you're younger, you're going to have to live with the changes longer than anybody else. So you better adapt quickly, right? Whereas like you're older, it's like you've got less time on the planet, so your need to change might not be as accelerated as being younger.
Okay, but check this out. What if you're somebody like Alan Holdsworth? Are you familiar, the jazz fusion guitarist?
I know the name, but I don't know his
He's
music.
just like can destroy the guitar but he plays things that are so far outside of my schema that I don't like it, but I listen to it anyway because I don't like it. It's like listening to the opposite side of the political spectrum, so you can not so much hate on them, but like be like, it's that tension actually feels a certain way. And I met Alan one time at NAMM, and I sit down and talk to him, and I was like, listen, man, I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but whenever I'm in a musical slump, I just listen to your music to scramble my brain, and I don't understand what you're doing, and I don't understand why you're playing a certain way. It's like the noise and the difference of it creates something in me.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know. It's like there's different applications, even if you're not super, because he was very successful in his own way, you know?
Yeah. I think also, Matt, it's like there might be an emotional thing that you're like, that rubs you the wrong way, but there's something in what he's doing that fascinates you, right?
Well, I've read a lot of articles about him,
Yeah.
and he's a really simple guy, just likes to drink beer in the pub with his friends. And, but he was just so cerebral. Mike, you've probably interviewed him a bajillion times, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, but he thought it was so funny though, when I told him that.
Yeah.
He was like, I've heard that before, actually. I was like, wow, that's cool.
I think that, there's also something about needing to have your patterns broken. It doesn't always feel good, but
he's like the chiropractor of guitar for me.
Yeah. But it's part of Brian Eno has those cards, the oblique strategies cards, which are basically built to like, you're in a creative rut, right? Or you're not really sure where to go with something. And the oblique strategies are meant to like break your pattern so that you're like forced to think in a different kind of way. Because at the heart of it, it's like creativity is really about problem solving. And if you're just going down the same path over and over and over again, then you're not really like the context change, and that problem, that way of solving a problem doesn't work anymore. Right. And it's like part of like the work that you're doing, I suspect, with PTSD and neural tunes is like, it's sort of looking at patterns that have been established, and like, how do we rework those patterns so that, someone like breaks that, the cycle and learns to deal with these stressful, the stress. I know that like there's neuroscientists that I follow named Andrew Huberman, and I know they're using VR to like treat PTSD as well, where they're using VR experiences to sort of reenact like traumatic experiences that soldiers have had, but it's in a safe space. So it's like, it's a traumatic experience, but you do it enough times and your brain starts to like, rewire itself, going like, I'm in a safe place. This is okay. I can get through this. And, it's kind of a similar principle that's used for some pharmaceutical drugs like Xanax, where it's like you have anxiety about, a certain pattern that you expect to happen. And the drug is essentially disrupting like the neurotransmitters that cause you to be very alert and anxious, and going through the experience and realizing that it's not something that you should be anxious about is part of like what helps the brain rewire itself and go like, oh, wait, this isn't like what I thought it was going to be. I can deal with this in the future. And obviously it's not as simple as that, but the general kind of principle, right? It's like, this is that thing that has to be massaged very carefully. But the point being is like for creativity, it's like part of what you're trying to do is like break these patterns that have been experienced. And some of that is like, has a healing mechanism. And some of it also has to do with like being able to go out and explore unafraid. And I think that's a key part of creativity. And it's not just music. It's like, it can be visual art. It can be anyone who's like really spends a lot of their time being creative. That might apply to the military as well. For instance, like if you're in the field, like every situation is different, right? So you got to come up with creative solutions like very quickly for any number of problems that might come up. And
that's
yes.
really, it's, we rehearse with the book, we operate with the mind in the military.
Yeah.
Because the book is written for pristine environments, but when you're in warfare, you don't have, other people don't always keep the same rules you keep, so you have to improvise.
Just not to go on this forever, but when you just brought that up, it was interesting where I'm really into like World War II and the Army Air Force, and there's these books that are out now about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what kind of led to that, the generals that put us in that direction. And you had the precision bombing loyalists, and there was no such thing as that. That was kind of a PR thing for Americans, like, no, we can drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet, so no civilians are harmed by this action. It was complete bullshit, because you could see the site if there was fog, and computers would get messed up because the ball bearings that would get the gyroscope would get frozen at 30,000 feet. So all that was completely out the window. But then you had the other side where it was like, well, we kind of don't care. We just want to kill everybody until they stop fighting. And it's interesting, the technology that fueled both of those patterns, and the personalities that fueled both of those patterns. So I think the point is just, the point is that this person makes is that if the people that were locked into precision bombing refused to believe that it didn't happen, and the people that were into like area bombing refused to believe that there was even a chance at not killing innocent people. And it's interesting because never the twain will meet. I think creatively sometimes, if you get into these patterns you're talking about, Vaughan, sometimes it takes a lot to get out of what you're used to doing.
Absolutely.
Well, on a side note, if the U.S. government dropped a bomb in a pickle barrel, it'd probably be the one that everyone's hiding in. Just so you know, working in the military for 20 years. But a little side thing. Well, hey, on that note, we are getting close to the top of the hour, and I would love to do a part 2 with you about VR sometime. We didn't really get into that.
We need to get your whole. We need to pick your brain about the technological interest that you have versus where that's taking music, and what your recommendations might be for creators moving into, this vast technological, desert that we're in. It. Well, not it's a desert. It's more of a vibrant forest with many trees, and weird animals. Because I think that what Matt and I have been trying to do is, speaking of changing perceptions, is smack some of the more intransient creators who just want to go, I've got guitar, I do stuff, or I make record, I get famous or not. Because it'd be interesting to see, and we've had some of these discussions offline with you that have been interesting about, what a creator needs to do in the future to maintain their mojo, kind of.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but I will say one thing that, not much up for discussion because it hasn't really unfolded yet, but something that I'm very excited about is the introduction of MIDI 2.0, because the original MIDI spec is got such bad resolution that it's really iced a lot of great musicians and performers out of electronic music production. And so what that's done to a lot of electronic music production has made it quite stagnant. There are people who are very good at it, who make incredible sort of architectural music with it. But the MIDI 2.0 spec basically takes MIDI from 8-bit to 32-bit, which increases the resolution from 128 steps to something like 6.5 billion. And
wow.
So with that level of resolution, what we're going to be able to capture from instruments that are enabled with MIDI 2.0 is going to be a whole nother level of expression. So I think it's going to be really exciting for people particularly from the classical world, and the jazz world, who I sort of consider as being like the Olympians of musicians, like those people suddenly having access to electronic music production and what that's going to do to that entire genre, I think is just going to be fascinating.
Do you see maybe going to straight MIDI recording in the future, where there's no analog, so to speak?
I mean, that seems unlikely, because MIDI is like a very limited spec. It's just like data that's like describes like what to do. It's like
off
it's
and
just
on.
off and on, like pressure controller information, like stuff that's like more to do with like the sensory interaction with the instrument than it is like the actual audio generation of it. But I think it has the potential to make new synth engines that are really, really interesting. So I think that'll be really cool. I mean, the problem with MIDI 1.0 has been that for traditional musicians who are really great performers, like you sit them in front of, I mean, obviously there's not really, I guess there was like a MIDI guitar in the 80s that didn't really go anywhere. But like for piano, it's like great pianists can like play a MIDI keyboard. You record like, into a MIDI sequencer with this awful resolution, and what comes back at you isn't like what they played in. You're like, what is that? So you're kind of almost forced to like quantize the music and like make it, perfect, because the poor resolution of MIDI is just always like recorded any kind of performance for the most part and just made it worse than what it was before. So that's all going to change, and I think that's super, super exciting.
Also more accessible too, because I mean, I know when I worked at Electronic Musician magazine, there were all these cracks to MIDI 1.0, and none of them were really, I mean, I forgot what the software was, but all these things where you move stuff around and try to beat the resolution, and I don't know if any of them ever worked, but man, you had to be such a brainiac to even, to even absorb the software, and it kind of took you away from the music, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's something that is yet to play out, and obviously there's a whole bunch of other things that are happening with technology that I think are super interesting. But that seems to me like the thing that's like immediately upon us, even though it hasn't really rolled out. And I don't know why the musical instrument manufacturers haven't really been like, going crazy about like promoting it. But you'd think there'd be an opportunity to sell a whole new line of gear. But I think that once it does roll out.
Getting MIDI 1.0 to have the manufacturers adopt that was not an easy
right. Yeah, that took years. Yeah. So, but I think it's, when it does come to pass, I think it's going to be really interesting, and in a lot of ways, like, I mean, there's so much great music out there, sort of under the hood of like the general popular music genre or whatever charts. And in some ways, like the things that seem to be charting these days feel a little bit to me like the end of the 80s, like what the end of the 80s felt like. And then Nirvana hit and techno music hit. And like, it was just like all that, like 1987 to like through 1989, just was like, wait, what was that? Like, just like the chapter changed. It feels a little bit like that's about to happen.
It seems like in my world, Nirvana was like the death of the guitar solo. So like, what do you think is going to die to get to the next level? What's going to be left behind in this next renaissance of music and art in the world, do you think?
I don't really know, but I do think that there's some interesting things that are happening with song structures. Whether it's Billie Eilish or number of other like younger popular artists, where like the sort of traditional like structure of like verse chorus, like bridge outro is like kind of changing. And I think that, so that's interesting. Then I also think that like VR, for instance, like where you're actually in a headset and you can be in there for a long period of time, like what concept, like if that thing is capturing your attention and you're not like, it's not like a typical Spotify experience where it's like you've got thousands of songs and you're like, oh, I'm bored, like next, right? So that's kind of forced music these days to be kind of almost like in this 50s like mentality where it's like all the songs need to be less than 3 minutes. Like don't Boris get us to the chorus is like never been more relevant.
There's no more Yes 3-panel albums,
right,
anymore. Yeah.
But I think that with new technology, that could very easily change. So I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I'm hesitant to make any like solid predictions, but I think that there's some really cool things with technology that are going to change expression and narrative storytelling.
What about long form versus short form?
Let's get you back to talk about it, because we're way over time now.
We don't want you to leave, Vaughan. So let's just be honest, and probably off camera, unless you got to go, we're going to ask some more questions.
Phone with us, and we'll
okay, so I won't. Yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap up today. Mike, thanks for the cue. So let's do closing remarks, and Mike, you first.
Well, I just Vaughan, thanks for being on the show. I love discussions about technology and strategies and concepts and all that. So it's been a lot for me to take in. I'll probably have to watch this again and absorb everything, but it's been a crap ton of fun, and I learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Vaughn,
we're so we haven't let you go yet.
Yeah. What's your closing remarks? What would you like to say to Kingdom of Rock?
Good luck, and I'm happy to help, and great to be here, and I'm thankful to have met you guys on Clubhouse, and looking forward to keeping the relationship going strong.
Cool. Well, speaking of Clubhouse, every Monday at 6 p.m. we do a little room called Tech Startups for Musicians and Creatives, where we talk about the intersection of mostly music and tech, and a little bit of entrepreneurship in there as well. Talking about getting funding for your company. It's kind of a little bit like a Shark Tank for musicians, although depending on who shows up, we might talk about how rhythms from indigenous cultures have affected humanity and popular music, or we might go. I mean, we've been all over the place. You've been in a lot of our rooms.
Yeah, so. And also it's not so sharky. It's more helpful, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Shark Tank, but we're not trying to bite anybody. We're just
right. We're trying
just
to be helpful musicians.
We don't have teeth. We're sharks without teeth, right?
Right.
Yeah.
We're not telling people to get the hell out of the room. No, that's bad. See ya.
Yeah, you're terrible. Go away. Yeah. Well, hey, thanks, Vaughn, for being on the show.
Absolutely.
We'd love to have you back for maybe we could do a tech version later on, or we might even have a VR panel or something like that. We'd love to have you come back. If anybody wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do it if they got a question for you?
Probably find me on Instagram. I've been forced on Instagram because of Clubhouse. So now I'm like all over Clubhouse. I mean, all over Instagram. So that's probably the easiest way. Just search me on Instagram and DM me.
All right. That's great. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Cool.
Kingdom of Rock every week on Wednesday, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Well, Pacific PDT time because of daylight savings, and 7 p.m. Eastern. We're here every week, and we're also going to be doing some new things here in the near future, but we're going to keep that secret, but be looking out for them.
Oh,
Matt Gibson.
You're like a government leak.
I'm a teaser.
Yeah,
I'm a teaser.
A leak is what you are.
I wish you were a little more attractive if you're going to be a teaser.
I mean, here, wait, hang on. There you go. All right, guys.
I have to go.